So as we kind of start this today, and I know that you were three presidents past the beginning of CAS,
Right.
but from what you may have heard as you talk to folks like Ted and Don and Phyllis, why was the idea of CAS ever conceived? Like, what made that become even a conversation that led to action?
Right. From my understanding, um, the impetus of this is because CACREP, which is the counseling standards, really, they were the only players in the, standards game in higher education at the time.
Okay.
And I think Ted Miller in particular and other people felt that those standards weren't appropriate for student affairs, or at least the majority of student affairs educators. So there was this idea that student affairs needed to create their own, and something that was really more explicitly useful for student affairs educators. The other part of that is, as student affairs was intending on being recognized as a profession, part of becoming a profession is having standards. So I think both of those really wanted to increase the professionalization of student affairs educators, and then also the only standards that existed at the time seemed inappropriate. So that was the creation of CAS. Now, interestingly, some student affairs professional associations had already created some standards. So for example, I was a member of NACA, National Association for Campus Activities, and we had our own standards.
Okay.
Yes, and in the 80s, at my institution, we were asked at Santa Clara University if we would be willing to conduct a study of our campus activities programs using the NACA standards. So we did. It was a very thorough study. It took us about a year, and it was very useful. And it was after that that I was contacted by NACA and asked whether I thought NACA should keep its standards. But of course, they were aware of the CAS initiative, and they were wondering whether they should embrace the CAS initiative or keep their own standards. Now, at the time, they did have a rep to CAS, but then they also had their NACA standards. So I went to a CAS meeting and came back and said, I think it makes sense to join the CAS parade because it would make it easier for a division to do assessment if everybody is using not the same standards, but at least standards that have the same structure. And so NACA bought that, and in 1989, they asked me then to be their rep to CAS. So that's how all that evolved. And I think, through the years with CAS, some professional associations did drop their own standards, but others kept theirs. Right. So there are some professional associations who belong to CAS and embrace CAS standards, but also have their own standards.
Now, did NACA drop their standards?
Yes.
Or so you all decided to drop those and just join with CAS altogether?
Right. And concentrate on the CAS standards, correct,
Okay. So you answered this in a way, but I just want to ask again, why were they so pivotal in the student affairs community, these CAS standards, these newly emerging standards?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, they added to the professionalization of our work, but I think also, and maybe as importantly, is they offered guidance. So as professionals went from institution to institution or office to office, each institution has its own context and is unique, but it offered some guidance as, what should I be concentrating on? What's not happening here. So I think that's really important. Like, for example, even when I went to George Mason, it became apparent that in our master's program, we didn't meet some standards regarding our practicum.
Okay.
And so, relying on the CAS standards, I could come to the institution and say, okay, we need to do something about this because we're not meeting some standards. So I think it shows where your weaknesses might be. And as a new professional at a different institution, how might you embark on your practice in this new context? And then of course, I have to look at my notes here. The third, yes, continual improvement. Okay, so once you've you've addressed the standards, and then how are you going to continually improve? Like, what are some weak spots? What maybe you meet the standards, but how could you even improve in excellence? So I think those are the three major reasons why CAS matters.
Okay, great,
Yeah.
great. So you were invited to represent NACA in 1989, and you
Correct.
went back and you convinced them to join CAS.
Yes,
Now,
yes.
how did CAS convince you sometime later to become president?
Oh gosh. Well, for me, yes. So I was involved in CAS from 1989 to 2008. And
Okay.
so my involvement increased incrementally over those years. So it wasn't until 1994 that I became a member of the executive board.
Mm-hmm.
And then it wasn't until 2005 that I became, president. And, I knew at some point, I wanted to take on a leadership role of, in some way in higher education. I'd worked all my life in higher education,
Right.
and I knew I wanted to take on a major leadership role. And CAS just felt natural. I mean, it just felt like a normal accumulation of my past experience. And so, yeah, I mean, I believed in the mission and the vision of CAS. I believed in what it was doing. And so I don't think there was much convincing, to
Oh,
be
is
honest.
that right? Well, that's great.
Yeah, I don't think there was much convincing.
Right. At that point, you were at Shippensburg, correct?
Correct,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
You may not remember this, but you were president of CAS when I joined.
Oh, sure, yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
And I served on my very first CAS committee with you. We were doing college unions.
Okay, very good.
Yeah. So it was a great introduction
Yes.
to CAS and the work that we do, which is so critically important.
Right, right. Which does, one thing I did want to say about, for me, and I would assume this is true for other CAS directors now, I don't think you use that term anymore, but for the people who
Representatives, right.
represent associations on CAS, there's so much professional development that goes on there. I learned so much about what other institutions were doing. You have these incredible intellectual thinkers and people who are doing some really monumental practice in higher education across the nation and internationally. And, I just learned so much about the field of higher education, what was on the horizon, but also I learned about writing and editing. So there was just so much, professional development available through CAS.
Yes,
So,
it's really quite a phenomenal organization. And when
yeah,
you think about bringing 40 plus professional associations together around a table and leaving there at some point on the same page,
yes,
really is
exactly.
quite interesting.
Yeah,
And I let the cat out the bag a bit when I said that you worked on the college union standards and you chaired that committee. But what other, do you remember what other standards you may have worked on that?
sure. Well, the assessment standards, the
Okay.
campus activity standards,
Uh-huh.
let's see, oh, multicultural program
I
standards.
remember that. Yes.
Yes. And the LGBT standards. And I think those two, the multicultural standards and the LGBT, are particularly prominent for me because I think we first had to convince some people that they needed, that they needed to exist.
Mm-hmm.
And the LGBT folks who were involved in that committee, and I have to call out Ronnie Sanlow, they were so appreciative of our work, that we were recognizing them as, a group of students who deserve voice and space and, representation, and assistance and support. So, I just really believe that they were very grateful that CAS took on this initiative. So that was a very prominent one. I also was involved with the individual excellence, the characteristics of individual excellence that we wrote. That also was difficult because, we had first thought about standards for the individual and that didn't quite fit. And so it took several years to come up with this, these characteristics of an exceptional professional. And I referred to them often, in class and teaching and in meetings. So they were very useful for me. And then, of course, at the end of Phyllis's presidency and through Don's, we became more and more interested in learning outcomes, learning development.
Right.
Yeah, so I was also involved within creating the learning development structure that CAS embraced.
I definitely remember that because that's when we began to make that shift in a more intentional way.
Yes.
Where you were president and led us to that. And now those serve as the centerpiece, as it were, for the CAS standards. As I do my presentations on CAS, I focus on the fact that hopefully these particular 6 learning domains center your work and how you create your process of reviewing your programs. Like, how are your programs encompassing these learning domains? And it's a very interesting conversation, particularly for new professionals or folks who've not really worked in any significant way with learning domains at all. And for them to see those and to be able to see how they work those into their program reviews using the CAS standards is an eye-opener for quite a few folks.
Oh, I bet. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, the other thing I remember vividly is the multicultural programs and services standards. I served on that committee. And I think one of the most interesting debates I ever had was with a member of the council, and we got into a debate about equity versus equality. And
yes,
it was a good while to get through that. Do you remember that conversation?
Oh, I sure did. Yes, exactly. Oh, yeah. And even well, in every standard, of course, there's an equity standard.
Right.
And how do we list the groups that we're talking about, the people we're talking about? And yeah, so all of that took a great deal of thought and evolution.
Evolution, absolutely. And the wordsmithing and just the processing, again, it's very insightful. There are other things that you may have done when you were president of CAS that you'd like to think about or highlight that made your experience as president even more meaningful. Are there other things that you'd like to point out?
Well, one of the issues that we took on was this notion of who should be around the table, like who's missing from the table, both in terms of representation, but also in terms of professional associations. And there was a bit of debate between services and educators. And are there services that don't educate? And we wanted to be programs and services that educate.
Right.
So that was, so that was a concern, and we tried to address that. And I specifically remember the dining services professionals who talked about, the student employees. I mean, all the student employees that they, that they have interactions with, and how that, if done well, that is indeed educational. And so I became convinced, yes, that dining services is it's a service, but it's also can be an educational program. So I do remember that conversation. The other conversation we had was about for-profit associations versus nonprofit. And I remember we were wondering about an association that would represent student government. And even though, you know, NACA does, but it's also a broader look at, you know, programming, student leadership, and also student government. But at the time, there were a couple of professional associations specifically looking at student government membership. And I would say we tried them on for a while, and that just didn't fit. And so we had to say, or I had to say to them, you know, you're not on the same page as we are. We need to let you go. Basically. So that was a difficult conversation, but I think that, you know, again, we're trying to refine, you know, so who's our clientele? Who are those professionals that are offering programs and services as educators? And some associations didn't fit.
Right. And we still have some that knock at the door that we have to look at. We have a formal process now, and you may have had it then, where they have to apply, and then there's a process that we go through to review and evaluate and make those determinations. So CAS has certainly grown. We are, I think, at 42 or 43 professional associations now. But in addition to the growth in the professional associations that are members, we certainly have also grown in our number of standards. We're now at 50 sets of standards. And to some people, that's really something to celebrate. To others, it's, I wonder, do we really need all of those? So we're constantly processing those things.
Right. Yeah. You know, and that does remind me when I first joined CAS and then became a part of the leadership team. You know, CAS, I think, was seen as joined at the hip with ACPA.
Yes.
And I think some of the smaller organizations were like, you know, where do we fit in? And I think, you know, my presidency and other people who followed, I think we wanted to communicate that all of the associations have voice here. And even though you're a small group and you're a specific group addressing, you know, a specific clientele, that's good. That's okay. You still belong at the table.
Well, I have to tell you, representing one of those associations that probably would not have been seen as critical, I'm happy to report that SACSA, which is a regional association, ended up being as involved in CAS as it has been, in that, you know, representing SACSA, I've been able to also be president. When we spent 10 years, as you recall, our bylaws state, if you're not national in scope or international in scope, you can only be a regional member. And for SACSA to have gotten involved and to remain involved is something that resonates with me relative to what you just said about all of us have a place at the table. When we can come talking about student learning, development, and success.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's been your assessment of CAS over the years now that you have retired and stepped away and traveling all over the place like Australia? What's been your assessment of the organization that you left?
Wow. Well, it certainly has evolved and grown, as you provided evidence of, right? It's also, I think, refined itself in meeting the needs. I mean, one of the things, you know, and now it seems funny to think about it, you know, how we were wondering about the print version.
Right.
You know, when do we move away from the print version? You know, how do we keep up with technology? I mean, that was always a concern, you know, to make them available, but in a user-friendly way. So I'm glad to see, you know, that has happened. And one thing that struck me, I don't know if you read the report, Truce, about DEI on college campuses that recently came out. And this report is in reaction to the congressional hearings on March 7th regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in higher education. And one of the concerns that congressional representative aired was the lack of standards. And I just thought, no, there are standards.
Yes.
Yeah, so we still have a way to go to be communicating, to the outside world that standards exist for these areas in higher education. And I think CAS is very well known within the higher education enterprise, but I mean, obviously government entities don't, and I think that's unfortunate. So I've been impressed. I feel like I've left CAS in very good hands. And, whenever I receive an email message and an update like today, I'm like, yeah, this was it was an important part of my life. It's still very meaningful for me. And brings joy to me every time I read, what CAS is up to. And I almost said what we're up to. So
right. What we're up to, because a part of you is still with us. A part of all past presidents still with us. We stand on that legacy and we appreciate it and we value it. So yes, us would be appropriate. What are we up to? What have we been doing?
Yeah. Oh, so let me say one more thing about DEI. I'm pretty passionate about this.
Right.
Yeah. So I want to encourage all those involved with CAS to take a look at what happened on March 7th. And if your representative is one of those people offering misinformation about no standards in DEI, I urge you to contact them and say there are standards in DEI.
We'll definitely pass on that challenge. It'll be something for us to really discuss at our upcoming meeting, which will take place next week, actually, in about a couple of weeks. So as you may know, we used to have 2 in-person meetings a year.
Yeah.
And now we only do 1.
Okay.
But the April meeting is still an important one. That's where we typically elect officers for the ensuing year, as well as approve any standards that may be on the docket. But our only in-person meeting now is in November.
Okay.
But they're all both critically important to the work of CAS overall. And in fact, I'll just let you know that in November, at our meeting in Alexandria, we are hoping that as many of you as possible can come back as past presidents as we really culminate the celebration of our 45th year.
Okay. All right.
That will be very, very exciting. Okay. So what is your future hope for CAS and its future?
Oh gosh, gee, I don't, I've never been very good at, procrastinating or
prognosticating.
Yes, yes, doing that with the future. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know, and I've been retired now. This is really hard to believe, since 2018.
Okay.
So it's hard to me to say what that might be. I think though that the key to CAS is individuals who care, right? Who care about the work, who care about students, who care about learning, and who emphasize learning. And I think that is, as long as you have people around the table, who care about those things, I think whatever CAS decides to embark upon would be appropriate.
Oh, great. You may know that a few years ago, under the leadership of, I'm blanking real quickly here, of Deb Garrett, we did what we called a Future Directions Initiative.
Right.
And we looked at CAS, we dissected, we tore it apart, and we just looked at every level of it. And as a result of the new directions, we came out of that experience with for the first time, fully funded marketing study. And that marketing study gave us so much information.
Mm.
Some of that we're still looking at and using the results to help make some of the decisions.
Oh, good.
Now, under the leadership of Gail Spencer, we're going to look yet again very deeply at CAS and where we need to pivot and where we need to change in order to look at the next level of change in higher education. So we're constantly turning the microscope inward and looking very carefully at who we are and what we're doing relative to the work that we have at hand to make sure we are relevant, to make sure that we are current, and to make sure that we are still viable as an important resource in higher education.
Sure.
So you know that that process of analysis is still there for CAS. As much as we encourage other folks to do that kind of assessment, we're also doing the same thing within the association.
Sure. Wow, terrific.
Yes. Well, Jen, thank you so very much again for the opportunity to spend this time with you. Thank you for the leadership that you provided all the while that you're on CAS, and particularly during your tenure as president. And again, as I said to Don, thank you for receiving the baton from Don and then passing it on to, I believe, was Susan.
Yes.
Yes, Susan Comerville.
Yes.
So
Yes. Yes.
we really appreciate that.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I appreciate it very much.
Okay. Well, take care.
You too. Bye now, Ralph.